Birendra of Nepal, the gentle monarch who chose democracy. Part 1. A Prince is Born, Early Life, Family, and Education of King Birendra. In the heart of the Kathmandu Valley, nestled within the grandeur of Narayanhiti Royal Palace, a royal birth unfolded on December 29, 1945. This marked the arrival of Birendra Bikram Shah Dev, a child destined to carry the weight of a Himalayan kingdom on his shoulders. As the eldest son of Crown Prince Mahendra Bikram Shah Dev and Crown Princess Indra Rajya Lakshmi Devi, Birendra's birth was more than just a celebration. It was a national event that stirred hopes for the continuity of the Shah dynasty that had ruled Nepal since the 18th century. Birendra's lineage carried the intertwined legacy of monarchy and divine right, deeply rooted in the traditions of Hinduism. His father Mahendra was a stern and visionary royal figure, whose ideas on governance and nationhood would later leave a lasting imprint on Birendra's formative years. His mother, Indra Rajya Lakshmi, a noblewoman of grace and dignity, came from the influential Rana family, a dynasty that had long intermingled with the Shahs through political alliances and marriage. The union of Shah and Rana bloodlines in Birendra reflected centuries of Nepalese aristocratic fusion, an embodiment of tradition, politics, and power. Growing up within the secure walls of the palace, Birendra experienced a childhood marked by formality, protocol, and ceremonial duty. However, this did not rob him of warmth. By many accounts, the young prince was an introspective, soft-spoken boy with an earnest curiosity about the world around him. His early education began within the palace, where he was taught by private tutors who provided him with a foundation in languages, history, culture, and religion. But his world would soon expand beyond the borders of Kathmandu. At the age of 8, Birendra and his younger brother Gyanendra were sent to India to study at St. Joseph's School, a Jesuit-run boarding institution in Darjeeling. This was a formative time in Birendra's life. Living far from home, among boys from a multitude of cultural backgrounds, he learned not just academics, but also humility, camaraderie, and self-discipline. The Jesuit model emphasized moral development and rigorous thinking, traits that would shape Birendra's worldview in his adult years. Teachers noted the boy's gentle demeanor, seriousness, and a certain detachment that suggested he was always quietly absorbing the world around him. He was not boisterous like some of his peers. Instead, he had the presence of someone preparing for a solemn purpose. While Birendra studied, history took a decisive turn in Nepal. On March 13, 1955, his grandfather, King Tribhuvan, passed away. With that, Mahendra ascended the throne, and Birendra, still a young boy, was officially designated as Crown Prince. The change of roles was not just symbolic, it altered the trajectory of Birendra's life. From that moment forward, he was no longer just a prince. He was the heir to a kingdom where the monarchy was seen not only as a political institution, but also as a guardian of national identity and cultural heritage. Recognizing the importance of preparing the Crown Prince for global leadership, Mahendra made a bold decision. In 1959, at the age of 13, Birendra was enrolled at Eton College in the United Kingdom, one of the world's most prestigious boarding schools. It was a place known for educating the sons of nobility, business magnates, and political leaders. The young prince was now far from the palaces and temples of Kathmandu, surrounded instead by the Gothic spires and traditions of British aristocracy. At Eton, Birendra's royal status was both a curiosity and a burden. He stood out among his peers, not only because of his title, His Royal Highness Prince Birendra of Nepal, but also due to his reserved manner and sincere modesty. He reportedly blushed whenever his full title was read aloud during assemblies. His classmates remembered him as a very, very nice bloke who never allowed his lineage to turn into arrogance. Far from acting the part of a prince, Birendra embraced the life of a student, quietly navigating his way through Eton's rigorous curriculum and ancient traditions. His years at Eton from 1959 to 1964 exposed him to Western ideas of liberalism, democracy, and civil responsibility. At the same time, the young royal remained deeply connected to his Nepalese roots. While other students spent holidays in the English countryside, Birendra often returned home to Nepal, where his father ensured that he would not grow distant from the customs and needs of his own people. Upon his return from Eton in 1964, Birendra did not immediately retreat to the comforts of palace life. Instead, he embarked on an extraordinary journey across his country. In a gesture that revealed his sensitivity and perhaps a desire to understand his future subjects, Birendra set out on foot to explore the remote, rural regions of Nepal. He stayed in humble village homes, ate local food, and observed the hardships and joys of life far from the capital. This experience profoundly shaped his understanding of Nepal's diversity, its geographic and ethnic complexity, and the fragile thread that held the nation together. Few royals in history had willingly stepped away from their thrones to live among their people in such a raw and personal way. Eager to broaden his education further, Birendra continued his studies overseas. He briefly attended the University of Tokyo, where he was exposed to Eastern philosophies and modernization models that influenced his thinking on governance. Then in 1967, he enrolled at Harvard University in the United States, where he studied political theory until 1968. At Harvard, Birendra encountered the works of philosophers, historians, and political scientists who wrestled with the ideas of power, governance, liberty, and responsibility. He absorbed these ideas with seriousness, recognizing the unique challenge of applying them to a deeply traditional monarchy like Nepal's. Beyond academia, Birendra developed an appreciation for art, culture, and global travel. In his youth, he journeyed to various countries, Canada, Latin America, Africa, and across Asia. These travels were not mere royal tours. They were opportunities for learning and cultural exchange. He admired Nepalese artists and artisans, collected paintings, and even learned how to fly helicopters, a skill that highlighted his adventurous and modern side. This blend of ancient tradition and global exposure would come to define King Birendra's reign. He was a monarch molded not only by bloodline and ritual, but also by the ideals of justice, peace, and humility. As he stepped into marriage and eventually into power, these early experiences of elite education, cultural immersion, and deep introspection would continue to guide the path he chose for himself and for his kingdom. Part 2. A Royal Union and the Dawn of Kingship. By the end of the 1960s, Crown Prince Birendra had returned to Nepal with a worldly perspective, having spent years immersed in global institutions and experiencing firsthand the varied political, cultural, and economic systems of both East and West. Now, standing at the cusp of adulthood, he was being prepared for the next phase of royal responsibility. Yet before ascending the throne, an equally important personal milestone awaited him: marriage. On February 27, 1970, Birendra married Aishwarya Raja Lakshmi Devi of the Rana family, a woman who would become both his queen and trusted partner in the years ahead. Their union was not merely one of affection, but also of dynastic significance. The Ranas had once ruled Nepal as hereditary prime ministers, wielding immense power, while the Shah monarchs were reduced to ceremonial roles. Although that era had ended with King Tribhuvan's political comeback in the 1950s, the alliance between the two powerful families symbolized a gesture of unity, reconciliation, and continued stability in the country's traditional power structure. Queen Aishwarya was no ordinary consort. Educated and poised, she was known for her intelligence, commanding presence, and sharp political instincts. The grandeur of their wedding was a reflection of Nepal's reverence for monarchy, tradition, and religion. Billed as one of the most lavish Hindu royal ceremonies in modern history, the nuptial event reportedly cost around $9.5 million. Delegations and dignitaries from across the globe flew into Kathmandu, and the entire city was swept into a frenzy of festivity. Sacred Vedic chants echoed across palace halls as ancient rituals were performed to sanctify the royal couple's bond. The streets were decorated, elephants paraded in ceremonial garb, and Nepalese citizens celebrated the promise of a new royal era. Only 2 years later, in a turn of fate, the nation mourned the death of King Mahendra. On January 31st, 1972, Mahendra Bikram Shah Dev, a monarch known for his assertive leadership and centralization of power, passed away due to a heart attack. At the age of 26, Birendra found himself suddenly elevated from crown prince to king of Nepal. Though young in years, he had already been shaped by a lifetime of preparation. His education, travels, and deep engagement with Nepalese society had molded him into a thoughtful, introspective, and modest man. Yet the transition was not easy. Birendra ascended the throne as a traditional Hindu monarch, where succession was not merely a political affair, but a sacred inheritance believed to be divinely sanctioned. Out of respect for his late father and in observance of Nepalese religious customs, his official coronation was delayed. According to court astrologers and Brahmin priests, the first year following a monarch's death was to be a mourning period. The subsequent year was marked as inauspicious due to unfavorable planetary alignments. It was thus only on February 24th, 1975, more than 3 years after his ascension, that King Birendra was formally crowned. The coronation was a spectacle of ancient ritual and modern diplomacy. Kings and queens, presidents and diplomats, holy men and monarchists from around the globe gathered in Kathmandu to witness the consecration of a Himalayan king. Dressed in traditional attire and adorned with the royal regalia, King Birendra sat beneath a golden canopy, receiving the sacred abhisheka, a ritual bath with holy water from rivers around Nepal. Chants filled the air as conch shells blew and flames danced from oil lamps. It was a solemn affirmation that the king was not merely a ruler, but also a divine intermediary between heaven and earth. Amidst the ceremonial grandeur, King Birendra's address to the nation marked a turning point. Unlike his father, whose reign was marked by authoritarian governance and the suppression of political parties, Birendra spoke with a softer tone. He emphasized peace, unity, and national development. There was a quiet humility in his words, a sense that he did not wish to rule with an iron fist, but to guide the nation toward progress, albeit within the framework he had inherited, a country governed by the Panchayat system. Nepal at the time was effectively an absolute monarchy. Political parties were banned, and the king ruled through a tiered system of local and regional councils known as the Panchayat, introduced by King Mahendra in the early 1960s. The Panchayat was presented as a uniquely Nepali alternative to Western-style democracy, one rooted in village governance and traditional authority. Yet in practice, it concentrated significant power in the hands of the monarch and his inner circle. As Birendra began his reign, he inherited both the authority and the burden of the system. While he remained publicly loyal to the Panchayat framework in his early years, those who observed him closely sensed a quiet unease. He was not a man who craved dominance. Rather, he appeared to carry the weight of his crown with thoughtfulness and restraint. Within palace walls, he listened more than he spoke, consulted widely, and rarely acted without careful deliberation. Ministers and aides would later recall how he would often work through stacks of documents himself, refusing to delegate tasks without understanding them fully. Despite his reserved and contemplative nature, King Birendra understood that ruling Nepal was no simple task. His kingdom was geographically challenging, socially diverse, and economically underdeveloped. From the snow-capped peaks of the Himalayas to the dense jungles of the Terai, Nepal was home to dozens of ethnic groups, languages, and traditions. It was a country in which religion, monarchy, and identity were inseparable. The king was not only a political figure, he was a symbol of unity, the living guardian of culture, faith, and continuity. During the initial years of his reign, Birendra worked to navigate the existing political structure while seeking subtle reforms. He sought to modernize the Panchayat system, create opportunities for development, and bring Nepal into closer alignment with the international community. Yet the very structure he inherited was resistant to change, rooted in centralized authority and often indifferent to the voices demanding greater political participation. Still, Birendra remained committed to his people. He continued his father's tradition of touring the country regularly, often visiting remote regions that were rarely touched by state presence. He walked through rice fields, sat in village squares, and listened to farmers and herders speak of their struggles. He met students, monks, craftsmen, and merchants, always encouraging education, self-reliance, and national pride. In the eyes of many Nepalis, he was a gentle monarch, an earnest, unpretentious king who lived simply despite his immense status. The early years of King Birendra's reign thus marked a delicate balance between tradition and reform, symbolism and governance. A new monarch had taken the throne, not with thunderous proclamations or sweeping autocratic gestures, but with a quiet resolve to serve, understand, and preserve the soul of his ancient kingdom. Part 3, the Panchayat system and the struggle for reform. When King Birendra officially assumed the crown in 1975, the political landscape of Nepal was defined by a system that bore his father's imprint, the Panchayat regime. This system, which had been instituted in 1960 by King Mahendra following the dismissal of a democratically elected government, was rooted in the philosophy of guided democracy. It touted itself as a uniquely Nepalese governance structure that emphasized traditional village councils, national unity, and monarchy as the fulcrum of political authority. Yet beneath the surface, it was an autocratic structure that denied political parties, restricted civil liberties, and placed near absolute power in the hands of the monarch. Birendra inherited this framework, and out of respect for his father's legacy and the perceived fragility of Nepal's institutions, he initially upheld it. But the new king's temperament was strikingly different from that of his predecessor. Where Mahendra had ruled with a commanding hand in a vision of centralized power, Birendra was contemplative and idealistic. He believed in consensus over coercion, persuasion over pressure. While he did not dismantle the Panchayat system outright, he quietly began to probe its limits and listen to dissenting voices. Still, the early years of Birendra's reign were marked by continuity. Political parties remained banned, and opposition leaders, particularly from the Nepali Congress, the country's most influential democratic force, were subject to surveillance, arrest, and exile. The Panchayat system relied on a hierarchical structure of governance, where local councils reported upwards to regional assemblies, which in turn were accountable only to the king. Though this created an illusion of grassroots representation, the reality was one of tightly managed political participation and limited space for genuine debate. Yet change was brewing. The global winds of democracy that had swept through much of the world in the 1970s and early 1980s were beginning to stir in Nepal. The youth, particularly students in Kathmandu and other urban centers, began to voice frustrations over a lack of freedoms, unemployment, and corruption. Their calls were not yet revolutionary, but they were persistent. Liberal intellectuals, former political prisoners, and underground party operatives began to cautiously build networks of resistance. The regime's grip on the public imagination was loosening. King Birendra, who had received his education in some of the world's most liberal academic institutions, was not unaware of these sentiments. He remained committed to preserving national unity, but he was also deeply troubled by the growing unrest. For a monarch who genuinely loved his people, ruling through repression was a moral dilemma. He sought a middle path, a way to introduce reform without triggering instability. It was in this context that, in 1979, King Birendra made one of the most significant political decisions of his reign. He announced that a national referendum would be held to allow the people of Nepal to choose their system of governance. The options would be a continuation of the partyless Panchayat system with promised reforms, or a transition to a multi-party democratic system. This announcement sent shockwaves through the country. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the people were being given a voice in shaping the political future of their nation. The referendum was held in May 1980. Leading up to the vote, both sides engaged in vigorous, though heavily state-regulated campaigns. The ruling establishment backed the Panchayat system, highlighting its supposed roots in Nepali tradition and its role in maintaining peace and stability. Supporters of multi-party democracy, meanwhile, emphasized the need for freedom, accountability, and modernization. It was a tense time in the nation's history, with student protests, rallies, and fiery debates dominating the public sphere. Ultimately, the Panchayat system won the referendum by a narrow margin of 55% to 45%. While the ruling class celebrated the result as an affirmation of national unity and tradition, the closeness of the vote revealed deep divisions within society. A significant portion of the population had openly rejected the existing system. The outcome signaled to the king that further reform was inevitable. True to his word, Birendra implemented a series of structural changes following the referendum. He introduced limited reforms to the Panchayat system, aiming to decentralize development and bring governance closer to the people. One of his notable efforts was the reorganization of Nepal into 5 development regions: Eastern, Central, Western, Midwestern, and Far Western. This move was designed to promote balanced growth across the country and reduce regional disparities. In the following years, the king made annual visits to each region, listening to local leaders and attempting to bridge the gap between Kathmandu and the countryside. These visits, however, were quietly discontinued after Nepal transitioned into a constitutional monarchy in 1990. Despite these attempts at reform, disillusionment with the Panchayat regime continued to grow. The system remained fundamentally unaccountable, and its cosmetic changes did little to address the frustrations of a politically aware and increasingly restless population. Birendra found himself trapped between his loyalty to tradition and his understanding of the need for progress. His cautious nature made him reluctant to pursue sweeping reforms, even as the political tide turned against him. Still, King Birendra's decision to hold the 1980 referendum is often remembered as a gesture of openness and moral integrity. In a region where monarchs often clung to power through brute force, Birendra's willingness to test the legitimacy of his rule through a public vote was unprecedented. Although the outcome preserved the status quo, the process planted the seeds of democratic consciousness that would bear fruit a decade later. The 1980s would continue to test Birendra's leadership as civil unrest, global political shifts, and internal contradictions mounted. But the king remained a figure of calm and civility, embodying the paradox of a benevolent autocrat, one who wore the crown with humility, even as the very institution he represented stood increasingly at odds with the aspirations of his people. Part 4. The People's Movement and the Making of a Constitutional Monarch. By the dawn of the 1990s, the seeds of discontent sown during the Panchayat years had grown into a powerful force of popular resistance. Though the 1980 referendum had temporarily preserved the partyless political system, the decade that followed saw the Panchayat regime steadily lose its grip on the imagination and support of the Nepalese people. For King Birendra, it was a period marked by mounting political pressure, intense personal reflection, and ultimately a courageous pivot in the direction of national reform. Throughout the 1980s, global democracy movements were sweeping across continents. From the crumbling of the Soviet Union to the fall of authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe and Latin America, the world was undergoing a historic transformation. Closer to home, neighboring India continued to thrive as a multi-party democracy, while pro-democracy protests erupted in countries like South Korea, Indonesia, and the Philippines. These global developments resonated deeply with Nepal's educated middle class, civil society, and increasingly organized political opposition. The air was electric with the desire for change. King Birendra was no stranger to these currents. His years at Harvard, Tokyo, and Eton had given him a broader view of governance and society. He was acutely aware that the rigid political model established by his father was fast becoming incompatible with the aspirations of a modern Nepal. But reform was never easy, especially when navigating a monarchy built on centuries of tradition, ritual, and perceived divine sanction. Still, Birendra remained a careful observer, measured, cautious, yet not unresponsive. The spark that ignited the firestorm came in early 1990. A series of coordinated protests, strikes, and civil disobedience campaigns broke out across the country, led primarily by the Nepali Congress and the United Left Front, a coalition of communist and socialist parties. The movement, known as the Jana Andolan, or People's Movement, spread like wildfire, gathering strength from students, labor unions, teachers, lawyers, and ordinary citizens. Kathmandu, once a quiet valley of temples and palaces, now pulsed with protest marches, slogans, and barricades. The government's initial response was harsh. Security forces cracked down on demonstrators, arrests surged, and violence began to escalate. Clashes between protesters and police led to injuries and deaths. The royal regime, cornered and overwhelmed, struggled to maintain control. For King Birendra, the moment of reckoning had come. Despite immense pressure from loyalists within the palace and hardliners in the Panchayat establishment, Birendra did not unleash the full force of the army to crush the protests. It was a critical decision, one that perhaps defined his legacy more than any other. In an era where many monarchs and dictators resorted to military crackdowns, Birendra hesitated. He had seen the bloodshed in places like Tiananmen Square and was determined not to let Nepal descend into similar chaos. Instead, Birendra chose to listen. In April 1990, after months of mass demonstrations and rising national tension, King Birendra made a historic announcement. He would lift the ban on political parties and begin a transition toward multi-party democracy. The decision sent a wave of euphoria across Nepal. Protesters laid down their placards. Political prisoners were released. Exiled leaders returned home. The king, once seen as a distant figurehead of a rigid system, was now being hailed as a monarch who had the wisdom and humility to yield to the will of the people. To guide the process of reform, Birendra appointed an independent Constitution Recommendation Commission. This commission was tasked with drafting a new democratic constitution that would reflect the aspirations of the people while preserving the ceremonial and symbolic role of the monarchy. The composition of the commission included representatives from the major political forces in the country, ensuring that it was broadly representative and credible. After months of debate and deliberation, the commission presented its draft to the king on September 10, 1990. The proposed constitution envisioned a new Nepal, a constitutional monarchy governed by a multi-party parliamentary system, with the king serving as the ceremonial head of state above the day-to-day politics of governance. Power would be vested in an elected prime minister and parliament. Fundamental rights and civil liberties would be guaranteed, and an independent judiciary would safeguard constitutional order. On November 9, 1990, King Birendra formally promulgated the new constitution. In doing so, he relinquished his executive powers, voluntarily stepping away from absolute rule to become a constitutional monarch. It was a rare act of grace and foresight in a world where few monarchs had so willingly surrendered power. Many political leaders and scholars across the region hailed Birendra's decision as an act of statesmanship, one that elevated the stature of the monarchy rather than diminishing it. In the years that followed, Birendra embraced his new constitutional role with dignity. No longer wielding political authority, he now served as a symbol of national unity, a bridge between tradition and modernity. His conduct in this new role won him widespread admiration. While many political leaders struggled with governance and inter-party conflicts, Birendra remained above the fray, a quiet, guiding figure who continued to tour the country, meet with citizens, and advocate for peace and development. Ironically, it was as a constitutional monarch that Birendra's popularity soared. Freed from the burdens of direct governance, he became a more relatable and respected figure among the people. His soft-spoken manner, simple lifestyle, and measured tone stood in contrast to the chaotic nature of party politics. In public perception, he transformed from an aloof king into a guardian of national identity. Yet the challenges for the kingdom were far from over. Though the political system had changed, the foundations of Nepal's socio-economic struggles, poverty, inequality, ethnic tensions, and lack of infrastructure, remained largely unresolved. Moreover, a new and more dangerous threat was emerging, a Maoist rebellion that would later plunge the country into civil war. Still, in 1990, for a brief and golden moment, Nepal seemed to be entering a new era of hope, and King Birendra stood at its heart, not as a ruler, but as a symbol of compromise, courage, and constitutional order. Part 5. A Monarch in a New Era. Democracy, Crisis, and the Shadows of Conflict. Following the promulgation of Nepal's new democratic constitution in November 1990, King Birendra transitioned into a constitutional monarch, a role that demanded restraint, diplomacy, and grace. For a ruler who had once wielded absolute power, this shift could have been jarring. But Birendra accepted the transformation with remarkable dignity. Instead of lamenting the loss of authority, he embraced his new position as a ceremonial figurehead, a stabilizing presence during a period of political upheaval and uncertainty. During the early 1990s, Nepal was still learning the ropes of parliamentary democracy. For the first time in decades, political parties were free to operate openly. Elections were held, governments were formed, and debates flourished in the public square. But with this newfound freedom came turbulence. The democratic institutions were young and fragile, and frequent changes in government, partisan bickering, and allegations of corruption began to wear down public trust. Within a few years, Nepal saw a rapid succession of prime ministers and cabinets, making political stability elusive. Through this period of transition, King Birendra remained a silent observer, intervening only within the confines of his constitutional role. He made it a point never to overstep his boundaries, even when governments faltered or political crises threatened to spiral out of control. He exercised his limited prerogatives carefully, often consulting the Supreme Court or legal experts before making any formal move. His deference to the rule of law and the spirit of the Constitution set an important precedent. While monarchs in other countries had attempted to reassert themselves during political turmoil, Birendra stood firm in his belief that the democratic process, however flawed, must be respected. In many ways, Birendra became more popular in this new democratic age than he had been as an absolute ruler. His humility, simplicity, and continued engagement with the people won him admiration across the political spectrum. The public saw him as a moral anchor, a wise and calm father figure in a country often thrown into the chaos of political maneuvering. He maintained his regular travels to all corners of Nepal, listening to local concerns and offering encouragement without wielding power. In the eyes of many, he was the nation's conscience, not its commander. Yet, as the 1990s progressed, a far graver threat began to emerge, one that neither the political establishment nor the monarchy had fully anticipated. On February 13, 1996, the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, launched a violent insurgency against the state, demanding the complete abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a people's republic. Their rhetoric was radical, their tactics brutal, and their appeal widespread, especially among marginalized communities in rural Nepal who felt neglected by both the Panchayat system and the new democratic government. The Maoist insurgency grew rapidly. Attacks on police stations, government offices, and infrastructure spread across the country. What began as a series of isolated attacks soon escalated into a full-blown civil conflict. Villagers were caught in the crossfire, and entire regions fell under de facto Maoist control. The government's initial response was reactive and fragmented, often relying on police forces rather than the military to quell the rebellion. Political parties were hesitant to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, fearing that militarization might undermine democratic gains. King Birendra, observing these developments, found himself in a moral and constitutional dilemma. As the head of state, he was the commander-in-chief of the Nepalese military. However, under the new democratic constitution, he could not act unilaterally or deploy the army without a recommendation from the elected government. More importantly, Birendra was deeply reluctant to use force against his own people. He understood the historical resentment that fueled the rebellion: poverty, inequality, ethnic discrimination, and the failure of successive governments to address these core issues. Though he condemned the violence, he also urged dialogue, inclusion, and reform as the ultimate solution. Despite mounting pressure from conservative royalists and even some cabinet members to crack down on the Maoist uprising with military force, Birendra resisted. He refused to allow the army to be used as a blunt instrument of repression. He believed that civil war would only deepen Nepal's wounds and erode the fragile gains of the democratic movement. In hindsight, many historians credit Birendra's caution during this period as a key reason why the monarchy continued to be seen by many as a force of moral restraint, even in times of national crisis. At the same time, Birendra began encouraging the government to pursue broader political reforms aimed at addressing the roots of the insurgency. He quietly supported rural development initiatives, land reform efforts, and education programs, particularly in the regions most affected by the conflict. He also intensified Nepal's diplomatic outreach to international partners, seeking support for peace building, mediation, and economic relief. Still, the situation worsened. By the late 1990s, the Maoist rebellion had claimed thousands of lives and pushed the country into an increasingly precarious position. Trust between political parties eroded further. Parliament grew paralyzed. Street protests became frequent once again, and the public began to grow disillusioned with democracy. Birendra, ever the patient listener, continued to host weekly Thursday meetings with the sitting prime minister, offering counsel while never issuing directives. His respect for the constitutional process remained unwavering. And yet his own position had become more vulnerable than ever. For the first time since Nepal's unification, the monarchy was under direct ideological attack. The Maoists called for its abolition, branding it as feudal, obsolete, and an obstacle to progress. Though many Nepalis still revered Birendra personally, they had begun to question the future of the institution he embodied. It was a deeply painful time for the king. Having guided Nepal through the storm of the democratic transition, Birendra now faced the rising threat of national fracture and violent revolution. Still, he held fast to his core beliefs, that peace was more powerful than violence, that inclusion was better than exclusion, and that the crown should serve the people, not the other way around. Birendra's legacy during this decade was one of restraint, dignity, and principle. In a country racked by insurgency, political turmoil, and social unrest, he remained a quiet force of unity. He was no longer the ruler who commanded the state. He had chosen to become its guardian, its listener, and its conscience. But as Nepal entered the new millennium, few could have imagined that the greatest tragedy of King Birendra's life, and perhaps the most shocking event in modern Nepalese history, was yet to come. Part 6, The Royal Massacre, A Kingdom Shattered. On the evening of June 1, 2001, the calm dignity of Nepal's monarchy, upheld so steadfastly by King Birendra for nearly 3 decades, came to a violent and unimaginable end. In what would become one of the most tragic and controversial events in modern monarchical history, Birendra, Queen Aishwarya, and almost their entire immediate family were murdered inside the very palace that had for centuries symbolized continuity, protection, and divine authority. The massacre at Narayanhedi Royal Palace shocked the nation and the world. It was a night that began like many others, with a family gathering in the royal dining hall, a tradition often observed at the palace. Present that evening were King Birendra, Queen Aishwarya, their eldest son Crown Prince Dipendra, Princess Shruti, Prince Nirajan, and other members of the royal family. These were not only the closest members of Nepal's royal household, but also the emotional heart of a nation that still looked to the monarchy as its unifying symbol. As reports would later claim, the attack began shortly after 8:30 p.m., during the informal portion of the gathering. According to official investigations, Crown Prince Dipendra, allegedly intoxicated and angry over his parents' opposition to his marriage plans, left the room only to return armed with multiple automatic weapons. In a matter of minutes, gunfire erupted across the banquet room. When the violence ended, King Birendra, Queen Aishwarya, Prince Nirajan, and Princess Shruti were among the dead. Dipendra, having reportedly turned a gun on himself, fell into a coma. The scene at Narayanhedi Palace was one of unimaginable carnage and disbelief. Guards and palace staff rushed in, but it was already too late. The palace, which for centuries had stood as a sanctuary of sovereignty and peace, had become the site of bloodshed at the hands of one of its own. The reaction from the Nepalese people was one of utter disbelief, grief, and very quickly, suspicion. Birendra had long been one of the most beloved monarchs in the country's history, soft-spoken, kind-hearted, and devoted to his people. He had successfully navigated the country through the transition from absolute rule to democracy, and even amid political upheaval, had retained public respect and moral authority. His murder sent shockwaves across the nation. Candlelight vigils, mass gatherings, and collective mourning gripped Kathmandu and beyond. Radio stations played somber music. People wept openly in the streets. As per royal protocol and succession laws, the gravely wounded Dipendra, still in a coma, was declared king. His rule, however, would be tragically brief. Over the course of 3 days, Nepal functioned under a monarch who could neither speak nor rule. On June 4, 2001, Dipendra died from his self-inflicted gunshot wound, ending what was technically the shortest and most surreal reign in Nepalese history. With the direct royal line extinguished, the crown passed to King Birendra's younger brother, Gyanendra Bikram Shah Dev. Gyanendra had not been present at the palace during the massacre. His sudden ascent to the throne, while constitutional, was met with mixed reactions. Many people struggled to accept the idea of a monarch other than Birendra. Some even questioned the official narrative of the massacre, unable to reconcile how such a disciplined and respected family could have imploded so violently without deeper, darker motives at play. Conspiracy theories emerged, whispers of political intrigue, foreign interference, palace coups, or internal sabotage. Though a government investigation blamed Dipendra, many remained unconvinced. In the aftermath, King Birendra was mourned as a martyr. His funeral, held with full Hindu royal rites, was attended by hundreds of thousands of citizens. Wrapped in the crimson royal flag, his body was carried atop a royal chariot through Kathmandu's streets. The outpouring of emotion was overwhelming. People threw flowers, sobbed openly, and lined the procession route for hours. The chants of "Long live Birendra" mixed with grief-stricken silence, creating a surreal atmosphere of loss and reverence. In that moment, it was clear that Nepal had not just lost a king, it had lost a part of its identity. Internationally, condolences poured in from around the world. Leaders from neighboring India, China, and countries across Europe and Asia expressed their shock and sorrow. King Birendra had been seen as a stable and moderate leader in a volatile region, someone who maintained Nepal's independence while promoting peaceful coexistence. His death created a diplomatic void as well as a moral one. Beyond the personal tragedy, the massacre marked a critical inflection point in Nepal's history. The monarchy, already weakened by political reforms and insurgent threats, was now irreparably damaged in the eyes of many citizens. The sacred aura surrounding the royal family had been broken. The idea that the divine protectors of the nation could be killed, and possibly by their own blood, shattered the myth of the invincible monarch. Faith in the institution began to unravel. In the weeks and months following the massacre, public trust in the monarchy diminished rapidly. Though King Gyanendra attempted to stabilize the throne, he lacked Birendra's moral authority, humility, and widespread affection. More importantly, the country was still in the grip of a worsening civil war with the Maoist rebels, and the loss of Birendra, a monarch seen as a protector of peace, left a leadership vacuum that no one could easily fill. The massacre at Narayanhiti was not merely a family tragedy. It was a national rupture, a sudden and violent severing of the symbolic thread that had bound Nepal's past to its present. For generations, the Shah kings had stood at the heart of Nepalese identity. With Birendra's death, that heart was broken. And though the crown would continue to rest on Gyanendra's head for a few more years, the golden age of Nepal's monarchy had come to an end in a cloud of smoke, bullets, and unanswered questions. Part 7. The Diplomat King, Sark, Peace, and Nepal on the global stage. Though King Birendra's reign is often remembered for his transition from absolute rule to constitutional monarchy and for the tragic royal massacre that ended his life, another enduring dimension of his leadership lies in the realm of diplomacy. Birendra was not only a monarch but a statesman, a visionary who believed deeply in dialogue, peaceful coexistence, and Nepal's sovereign identity on the global stage. In a region plagued by conflict and power rivalries, he carved out a unique space for Nepal as a neutral, peace-loving, and cooperative nation. From the very beginning of his kingship in 1972, King Birendra was determined to assert Nepal's independence in foreign affairs. Sandwiched between two giants, India to the south and China to the north, Nepal's geopolitical position was delicate, and its sovereignty had historically been tested by external pressures. Birendra, understanding this precarious balance, adopted a cautious yet active diplomacy. His first state visits as king, to India in October 1973 and China shortly thereafter, signaled his intention to maintain equidistant and friendly relations with both powers. One of his most significant diplomatic efforts was the proposal to declare Nepal a zone of peace. Introduced in a speech to the United Nations in the 1970s, this idea was not just a rhetorical flourish. It was an earnest appeal rooted in Nepal's ancient traditions of nonviolence and neutrality. Birendra cited Nepal's long history of avoiding military entanglements, its status as the birthplace of the Buddha, and its cultural identity as a peaceful Himalayan nation. He envisioned Nepal as a buffer of calm in an otherwise turbulent region. The proposal for the zone of peace garnered considerable international support. By the late 1980s, a total of 116 countries, including global powers and developing nations alike, had endorsed the idea. It resonated with the non-aligned movement and reflected Birendra's broader foreign policy philosophy, one that rejected military alliances and emphasized sovereign neutrality. Though India declined to endorse the proposal, fearing strategic constraints, the initiative elevated Nepal's global image and positioned Birendra as a peace-oriented leader in a militarized region. Equally important was his role in founding the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC. In the early 1980s, King Birendra began advocating for a regional platform that could foster economic, cultural, and political collaboration among South Asian nations. He believed that shared history, geography, and challenges such as poverty, underdevelopment, and environmental degradation called for collective solutions. Birendra personally spearheaded diplomatic efforts to bring the countries of South Asia together. He reached out to heads of state, initiated dialogues, and lobbied for the creation of a multilateral framework that would prioritize cooperation over competition. His perseverance bore fruit when SAARC was officially established in 1985, with Nepal as one of its founding members. The first SAARC summit was held in Dhaka, but King Birendra succeeded in having the permanent secretariat of the organization located in Kathmandu, a symbolic recognition of Nepal's central role in regional diplomacy. Through SAARC, Birendra envisioned a South Asia united not by military pacts, but by a shared commitment to development, education, cultural exchange, and food security. Under his guidance, Nepal actively supported the establishment of a South Asian food reserve to mitigate the impact of natural disasters, as well as regional initiatives in health, science, and technology. Though SAARC would later face criticism for its limited effectiveness, its founding spirit remains a testament to Birendra's desire for peaceful progress in a region too often marred by conflict. In addition to these regional efforts, King Birendra also worked diligently to expand Nepal's global diplomatic network. When he took the throne in 1972, Nepal maintained formal diplomatic relations with just 49 countries. By the end of his reign, that number had nearly doubled to 96. Birendra saw diplomacy not only as a tool for political survival, but as a means of cultural exchange and national pride. He encouraged Nepal's ambassadors to promote tourism, art, and heritage. He welcomed foreign dignitaries with warmth and emphasized Nepal's identity as an independent nation with deep spiritual and historical richness. Perhaps one of the most humanistic aspects of his foreign policy was his commitment to peacekeeping. In 1986, King Birendra established Nepal's peacekeeping training camp to prepare military and police personnel for international service. The camp was later upgraded and renamed the Birendra Peace Operations Training Center. It became the foundation through which Nepal became one of the most respected contributors to United Nations peacekeeping missions worldwide. Today, thousands of Nepalese peacekeepers serve in conflict zones around the globe, a legacy that began with Birendra's vision of Nepal as a gentle force for global good. His commitment to peace extended even to domestic matters. In 1974, when Khampa rebels, Tibetan guerrilla fighters supported by foreign powers, began operating in northern Nepal against China, King Birendra managed to disarm them without bloodshed. Offering land, citizenship, and financial incentives to those who surrendered, he avoided a confrontation that could have drawn Nepal into a dangerous regional conflict. The peaceful resolution not only improved Nepal-China relations, but also underscored Birendra's belief that dialogue was stronger than gunfire. King Birendra also remained steadfast in his belief that Nepal must chart its own course. He was careful not to allow foreign powers to dominate Nepalese politics or economics. Though grateful for foreign aid, he insisted on national sovereignty and decision-making. He promoted a foreign policy that combined openness with caution, a balance between engagement and independence. In an era dominated by Cold War tensions, arms races, and ideological rivalries, King Birendra stood out as a quiet advocate for peace, moderation, and regional unity. His diplomatic legacy, rooted in trust, dialogue, and vision, helped Nepal maintain its sovereignty and identity while giving it a respected voice on the international stage. Though the world remembers him for the tragic way his life ended, those who study King Birendra's diplomacy remember something else: a monarch who chose peace over power, bridges over walls, and partnership over domination. In the grand halls of the United Nations, in the quiet corridors of regional diplomacy, and in the hearts of his people, Birendra's voice still echoes, not as a conqueror, but as a peacemaker. Part 8, Guardian of the Land, King Birendra and the Green Legacy. Among the many dimensions of King Birendra's reign, one of the most remarkable and often underappreciated was his deep commitment to the natural environment. In an age when environmental issues were only beginning to gain global attention, Birendra stood as a forward-thinking monarch who recognized the intrinsic link between nature, national identity, and the well-being of future generations. His reign marked the formal beginning of state-driven conservation efforts in Nepal, setting in motion a legacy that continues to shape the country's environmental policies today. Nepal, blessed with the towering Himalayas, lush valleys, and fertile plains of the Terai, is one of the most ecologically diverse countries in the world. Its mountains are home to rare species like the snow leopard and red panda. Its jungles shelter elephants, tigers, and rhinos. Birendra, who had grown up exploring this land and later walked among its people during his post-Eton journeys, understood not only the beauty of Nepal's landscapes, but also the threats facing them: deforestation, poaching, human encroachment, and climate pressures. In the early 1970s, Nepal faced an alarming ecological crisis. The rhinoceros population in Chitwan was on the brink of extinction due to rampant poaching and human migration into the Terai lowlands. Recognizing the urgency, King Birendra personally endorsed the creation of specialized anti-poaching patrols. A 130-member rhino patrol force, Agaida Gasti, was formed to protect the endangered species. Along with this, a legal framework was developed to ensure long-term conservation, including the National Park and Wildlife Conservation Act. These actions culminated in the formal gazetting of Chitwan National Park in 1973, Nepal's first national park. This marked the beginning of a visionary campaign. Over the next 2 decades, under King Birendra's guidance and encouragement, Nepal saw the establishment of an unprecedented number of protected areas. These included not only national parks but also wildlife reserves, conservation areas, and hunting reserves, each carefully designated to preserve the country's vast biodiversity while promoting ecotourism and sustainable livelihoods for local communities. In 1976, Birendra's administration gazetted the Royal Karnali Wildlife Reserve, later known as Royal Bardia Wildlife Reserve, aimed at conserving the Bengal tiger and other species. The reserve was expanded and upgraded to national park status in 1988, becoming a vital stronghold for wildlife in western Nepal. In the same year, Langtang National Park was established in the northern Himalayas, covering over 1,700 square kilometers and protecting alpine forests and high-altitude fauna. King Birendra's conservation vision was holistic. He supported the establishment of Rara National Park in 1976, which protected the pristine Rara Lake, the largest lake in Nepal, along with its surrounding alpine ecosystem. The same year saw the gazetting of Koshi Tapu Wildlife Reserve in the Eastern Plains, a critical wetland habitat for migratory birds and endangered wildwater buffalo. Royal Shuklafanta Wildlife Reserve in the far western Terai and Sagarmatha National Park in the Everest region, both declared in the same period, extended this green corridor from jungle to snow-covered peaks. Sagarmatha National Park, which includes Mount Everest, was especially close to the king's heart. In 1979, with his support, it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Nepal's first natural heritage listing. The park stood as a global symbol, not only of Nepal's natural majesty, but also of the nation's commitment to environmental stewardship. Chitwan National Park was later added to the World Heritage List in 1984, further highlighting the international recognition of Birendra's conservation efforts. The scope of his environmental legacy expanded further in the 1980s. Kaptad National Park in the far west, established in 1984, protected sacred highlands revered by local hermits and mystics. That same year, Shah Foxendo National Park was created in Dolpa, encompassing nearly 3,600 square kilometers of trans-Himalayan terrain and the stunning Foxendo Lake. The remote wilderness of Dorpatan was designated a hunting reserve in 1987, a rare example of blending traditional royal hunting customs with regulated conservation. King Birendra also supported institutions to back these ecological goals. In 1990, he founded the King Mahendra Trust for Nature Conservation, KMTNC, named in honor of his father, to promote community-based conservation. The trust coordinated environmental research, local development, and wildlife protection. With then Prince Gyanendra as chairman, KMTNC pioneered the Annapurna Conservation Area project, the first large-scale effort to involve local communities directly in managing a conservation area. Birendra's approach to conservation was not exclusionary or elitist. Unlike traditional models that often fenced off protected areas, displacing indigenous people, he encouraged community participation. He believed that local ownership of environmental stewardship was essential to long-term success. Farmers, herders, and villagers living near the parks were encouraged to become forest guardians, eco-tour guides, and conservation workers. In the realm of global environmental diplomacy, Birendra also made his mark. He supported Nepal's participation in international conferences and conventions on biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development. His advocacy for balancing nature with development became an integral part of Nepal's national planning strategies. Roads were built with environmental studies, hydropower projects were reviewed for ecological impact, and rural development was increasingly tied to forest protection and reforestation efforts. Even his tourism policy reflected these values. Instead of mass tourism, Birendra promoted high-value, low-impact ecotourism. Trekking routes like the Annapurna Circuit were protected under strict environmental guidelines, ensuring that tourism income did not come at the cost of cultural or natural destruction. King Birendra's environmental vision stemmed from a deep cultural and spiritual reverence for nature. In the Hindu-Buddhist worldview of Nepal, forests are sacred, rivers are divine, and mountains are gods. Birendra embodied this ethos. Whether it was standing quietly under a rhododendron tree in the hills or visiting a ranger outpost in the jungle, he carried himself not as a conqueror of nature, but as its humble custodian. Today, when tourists marvel at the snow-capped peaks of Sagarmatha, when rhinos roam freely in Chitwan, or when migratory birds return to the wetlands of Koshi Tapu, they are witnessing the living legacy of a king who saw nature not as a resource to be exploited, but as a treasure to be protected. In the face of modernization and population growth, Birendra's foresight preserved some of the last great wildernesses of the Himalayas, not only for his people, but for the world. Part 9. Legacy of a Gentle King, Memory Reflection in the End of an Era. When King Birendra Bir Bikram Shah was laid to rest in June 2001, a nation did not merely mourn the passing of a monarch, it mourned the loss of a soul who had quietly guided it through some of the most critical chapters in its modern history. His reign had spanned nearly 3 decades, a period marked by dramatic transformation, from absolute monarchy to multi-party democracy, from diplomatic seclusion to global engagement, from isolated traditions to the complexities of modern nationhood. In the days, months, and years after his death, Birendra's image emerged from the shadows of palace walls into the hearts of millions. He was not remembered for grand declarations or displays of force, but for his modesty, patience, and unwavering sense of duty. Where many rulers use their position to dominate, Birendra used his to listen. He had no taste for authoritarianism, despite inheriting a system that gave him absolute power. And when the moment came to choose between the crown and the will of the people, he chose the people, preserving the monarchy by relinquishing its absolute authority. From the earliest days of his youth, Birendra's personality had stood apart from that of the typical autocrat. Teachers at Eton described him as polite and humble, a young man almost embarrassed by the pomp of his own title. Classmates recalled his easygoing nature, his reserved demeanor, and his quiet thoughtfulness. His education abroad had shaped him, but it never severed him from his roots. When he returned to Nepal, he willingly walked among its poorest villagers, eating simple food, sleeping in modest homes, and absorbing the lives of those over whom he would one day rule. Even after becoming king, that humility never left him. Unlike many monarchs, Birendra never indulged in extravagant displays of wealth. He lived simply, dressed modestly, and interacted with citizens in a soft-spoken, almost fatherly manner. His connection with the Nepalese people was not theatrical. It was authentic. He was not known for shouting commands or issuing threats, but for spending hours reading reports, reflecting, and seeking wise counsel. In fact, many who worked with him described his habit of working late into the night, often reviewing matters of state with a pen in hand and a quiet gaze. His reign was not without criticism. Historians have debated his slowness in initiating reforms during the Panchayat era. Some have argued that he lacked the assertiveness or political acumen to drive Nepal toward rapid development, unlike his father King Mahendra. Others suggest that his deep concern for tradition and consensus may have slowed necessary changes. The economic stagnation of the 1980s, the limited reach of foreign investment, and the bureaucratic inefficiencies of the Panchayat system all tarnished the monarchic image he inherited. Yet these criticisms rarely turned into personal disdain. Even his detractors acknowledged his sincerity. They criticized the system, not the man. Even in later years, during the chaos of party politics and the eruption of the Maoist insurgency, the public's respect for Birendra endured. In an increasingly fractured political landscape, he remained one of the few unifying figures, someone who could transcend party lines, ideologies, and class divisions. His moral compass was best illustrated during the rise of the Maoist rebellion in the mid-1990s. Though the insurgency posed an existential threat to the monarchy itself, Birendra refused to deploy the army against his own citizens without exhaustive attempts at dialogue. He feared that doing so would plunge the country into civil war, deepening divisions and bloodshed. This restraint earned him admiration even among those who had little regard for the institution of monarchy. For many, Birendra was not just a king, he was a humanist. The mystery and horror of his assassination only deepened his mythos. The royal massacre of 2001, in which he and most of his family were slain, continues to haunt the national psyche. To this day, conspiracy theories abound, and many Nepalese remain skeptical of the official account. That so peaceful and gentle a man could meet such a violent end seemed unbearable. It shattered the illusion of royal invincibility and cracked the emotional bond that many had with the monarchy itself. Following his death, the monarchy under his brother Mahendra faltered. The same respect and trust that had surrounded Birendra did not extend to his successor. The Maoist insurgency intensified. Political parties became increasingly fractured. In 2006, after another wave of protests known as the People's Movement II, the monarchy's political power was fully stripped. In 2008, the centuries-old Shah monarchy was formally abolished, and Nepal was declared a republic. Yet even as the institution fell, the image of Birendra remained untarnished. Streets, parks, schools, and statues had once carried his name, many of them renamed after the fall of the monarchy. But in the collective memory of the people, his presence remains strong. He is remembered not with reverence for power, but with affection for his character. He is mourned not because he was a king, but because he was kind. In today's Nepal, Birendra's legacy can still be felt in the institutions he helped create and protect. The national parks, the diplomatic achievements, the Constitution of 1990, the Peacekeeping Training Center, all these endure. His promotion of education, environmental conservation, and social service laid a foundation upon which future generations continue to build. But perhaps his greatest legacy is intangible. The idea that even in a position of supreme authority, one can rule with restraint, humility, and empathy. In the story of South Asia, so often marked by conflict, authoritarianism, and populist fury, King Birendra stands apart. He was not a revolutionary, but a reformer, not a warrior, but a reconciler. In the quiet hills of Nepal, in the sacred forests he helped protect, and in the hearts of the people he served, Birendra's memory endures, not merely as a king who once was, but as a leader who truly listened.